Welcome, everyone, to the Fantasy and Betting Podcast presented by the 33rd Team. I am your host, as always, Josh Larky. Today's theme is, if you are still drafting and you need some last-minute advice, we have you covered. Ryan Reynolds, my co-host, and I have provided articles on the33rdteam.com that are free for how to beat your leagues, hosted on Yahoo, on ESPN, on Sleeper. If you want to draft against us, well, we have free drafts for our Discord users. Go to my Twitter at JLarkyTweets and click in the link tree and you'll see an easy link to join our free Discord. We're hosting about a dozen leagues. They're all free to join. We're going to have some extremely exciting prizes like signed jerseys. And I would definitely recommend hopping in one of those. Ryan, your league filled very quickly.
Yeah, that was good to see, man. I was very happy to see that. Couldn't even get a post out for
it. Well, I'm going to pass it off to you now. Ryan's at Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. Make sure that you tell him all of your favorite actor takes from Deadpool. Ryan, I'm gonna let you host this one since it's time for me to play a little bit of analyst here.
Yeah, you're the fantasy guy, Josh. So, that's what you should be doing. And here's the thing. We got one more big weekend for fantasy drafts. People will draft through Wednesday. I know I have friends that draft on Wednesday before the season starts. So let's give you guys some advice for your last leg drafts here. Now, for me, the first 3 rounds, and I'm sure this is the same for you too, Josh, largely dictate my roster construction. In general, I'm looking to start with either 3 wide receivers or 1 running back and 2 wide receivers. However, on a number of platforms, running backs are going very early. So instead of taking a guy like, say, Dameon Pierce, like a round and a half earlier than we would in a high-stakes league, I'm more interested in taking a running back in the first round than I am in, high-stakes or best ball tournaments. And those home league type situations, I'm looking for one of those guys potentially, Nick Chubb, Saquon Barkley, etc. And then in round 2, Amon-Ra, Garrett Wilson, Jalen Waddle. Then back in round 3, I run Chris Olave. I'd be very, very happy with that start. I have a $500 entry home league on Monday where that's my game plan for it. So now, Josh, what are you looking for in the early rounds?
So a lot of people, I think, try and overcomplicate this sometimes. And I think you laid it out really well. I'll talk about there's pretty much just 2 things that I wouldn't really do for my first 3 rounds because not everyone's going to agree with our player takes. That's okay. We won't get offended. Sure. Ultimately, anyone going in the first 3 rounds does have some type of floor and some type of ceiling. That's pretty nice for fantasy, or else they wouldn't be an early round pick. So the thing I wouldn't do, I wouldn't start running back times 3. A lot of people out there, they call it robust RB or they call it the boomer lifestyle. And they're like, I need to lock up my 300 touch running back. I just wouldn't do that. You're going to hate how swiftly wide receiver talent falls off. And then the other thing that I wouldn't do is not having any receivers through 3 rounds. I'd want at least 1, probably 2, like you said, but I think if you have 1 through 3 rounds, you can manage it. So a lot of people out there, they might like going Travis Kelce, then Derrick Henry, then Patrick Mahomes, locking up the fun Chief stack. You get a great running back. But I actually, even though I could see the case for Derrick Henry over someone like Jalen Waddle in a vacuum, I'd rather do a start like that where it goes Travis Kelce, Jalen Waddle, then Patrick Mahomes, just to make sure that we do have 1 receiver through 3 rounds.
Now, before we jump into round 4 and 5, Josh, something we found when we were researching those ESPN Yahoo sleeper articles is that we can get major value on players that can transform our draft strategy from, best ball or high stake leagues roster construction. Now, you and I both do we both do high volume, tons of best balls. We said hundreds of teams. I recently did 2 main event entries, $2,000 entries with Gary Hartman and Cody Main from Establish the Run. And one of the things I want to do in a home league is I want to make teams that aren't possible in a high stakes league. One of the advantages I think there is Deontay Johnson's going late in most season long leagues. I'm pretty comfortable with him as my wide receiver 3 in a full PPR format in round 6 or 7. That will make me change how I'd normally strategize my roster in general. I might take a running back or a quarterback earlier because of that. Now, do you feel the same way about Johnson?
So first off, everyone, make sure you're following Ryan at Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. I don't know anyone else out there that has the combination he does of playing in the high stakes leagues, playing in the more casual leagues, being a kind of borderline pro better. There's very few people that have the well-rounded and also like extremely high level in many aspects skill set that Ryan does. Now, to answer your question about Deontay Johnson, there have been 3 receivers that hit 140 targets each of the past 3 seasons. That's a lot of targets. Stephon Diggs and Devontae Adams, those guys are gone by round 2 of your fantasy draft. The other guy is Deontay Johnson. He's in many ways just the cheapest way in fantasy to access incredibly high volume at the receiver position. Last year, we know he didn't score any touchdowns. Well, that's kind of what happens with a rookie quarterback in Kenny Pickett. Pickett had 7 touchdown passes. That's great. He had 9 interceptions. That's not great. That's actually terrible. 7 to 9 interception ratio. For anyone out there that's like, wow, he sounds like he'll never be good in football, I urge you to check out Jared Goff's rookie year because it looks very similar, right? I'm sure you remember that season. Jared Goff looked absolutely awful. He looked like a fish out of water. And then in year 2, he actually had very, very solid stats across the board and was propping up multiple fantasy receivers. So I think we could really see that leap from Pickett. And that's many ways why I'm in on Deontay Johnson. I'll also mention that the Steelers, we do expect them to get better this year. And when Ryan's real NFL power rankings drop at the start of next week, you'll see that the Steelers are still hovering in a pretty nice range where we understand that Kenny Pickett was bad and that quarterback's the most important position, but I think we all expect a pretty massive leap for him. And I think we'd both expect him to actually have better stats than all the rookie quarterbacks for this season.
Follow Josh at Larky Tweets on Twitter. I actually love the Jared Goff parallel. I hadn't thought of that. That's really, really good. That makes a lot of sense. And, I think it's possible too. On that note, Josh,
before we keep going, let me do the super quick hitting stat search for Jared Goff, because this always makes great radio, because I don't think people realize how bad it was. As a rookie, he had 5 touchdown passes and 7 interceptions. The next year, he had 28 touchdowns with only, again, 7 interceptions. All right. There you go, folks. Kenny Pickett, it's possible.
I know. I'll say this too. I dabble in sports collectibles to invest in players. I bought the dip on Jared Goff, and I bought the dip on Kenny Pickett this offseason. So there's that too. Now, Josh, back to fantasy football. Give us a few more mid-round players that are changing your draft strategy.
Yeah, and what we mean by this is really you see where you can get these guys, and then you don't necessarily have to target that position too much early on. The 2 guys would be at running back. We'll start with Alvin Kamara, who often you can get as late as round 7 or 8. I'd be willing to take him in round 5 or 6 if I had to. So wherever you think he's going to go, you can always just take him around early, and I wouldn't feel bad about that. He's only suspended 3 games. At times last year, Kamara had one of the 2 or 3 best roles in all of fantasy. He averaged 15 carries and 4 receptions a game last year. That's pretty incredible. We have a new quarterback, Derek Carr. I don't think he's going to be that much better than Andy Dalton in terms of the rough end of season efficiency stats. Dalton was actually pretty efficient, but I think the highs for this offense will be higher with Derek Carr than with Andy Dalton. And the Saints, according to most sources, especially our internal metric, we had them as by far the easiest schedule in the NFL. They're going to blow out a lot of opponents. They're going to score a lot of touchdowns. Alvin Kamara had never averaged fewer than 18 fantasy points a game prior to last season. He only had 14 fantasy points a game. Only. He was still a borderline fantasy RB1. And when you look, he had 4 touchdowns on 280 touches. The easy schedule is going to immediately fix that calculus. And I think he's just an excellent pick where most fantasy playoffs start in week 15, and he's coming back in week 4. You'll have plenty of time. With the other guy that has changed my strategy is David Montgomery at the running back position. Man, if Alvin Kamara and David Montgomery are my first 2 running backs selected, and I'm going pretty much 0 RB, I'm going to be very happy if I have elite receivers, elite quarterback, and elite tight end and still get Kamara and Montgomery on my team. David Montgomery's averaged 268 touches and over 1,200 total yards per season through 4 years. He's playing behind the best offensive line of his career. He's 25 pounds heavier than backfield mate rookie Jahmyr Gibbs. Last year, the Lions running backs had the most fantasy points per game, despite their starter, DeAndre Swift, barely playing due to injury. We had the 33rd Team Zone and NFL insider Ari Mayrov on the podcast a couple weeks ago, and he said that he views the team views Jahmyr Gibbs like early career Alvin Kamara. 6 to 10 carries a game, 4 to 6 receptions per game. And that David Montgomery, to quote Ari, is going to be the bell cow. He's going to get most of those backfield touches. So if I'm able to lock up most of the backfield touches in the Lions offense and then get one of the best receiving backs in NFL history in Alvin Kamara, while still locking up great picks at every other position, that feels like a very, very solid draft strategy.
Follow Josh at Larky Tweets. And if you have a draft coming up between now and opening day, Josh's cheat sheets on the website. I know when one of my friends asked me, Ryan, how can you help me with draft advice? I just give them the link to Josh's cheat sheet. Now, Josh, back to round 4 and 5. Usually I have at least 2 wide receivers entering the 4th round. Sometimes I have 3. If I'm in a format that has 3 wide receivers and 1 flex, there's times that I'll fill the flex with wide receivers through round 5. And that $500 league I mentioned before, I do that pretty much all the time. That said, if I'm getting Johnson in the 6th or 7th round, it gives me some more options. I'm more likely to take a quarterback in the first 5 rounds this year than I normally am. And I'm more likely to take a second running back in the first 4 or 5 rounds for that reason. Now, what are you thinking in this range, Josh?
So at quarterback, I love Lamar Jackson in round 4. Many people remember in 2019 when he broke fantasy. He had the most fantasy points per game by a quarterback in history of fantasy football. 2019, that was the season he's rushing for over 1,000 yards, and he led the NFL that year in passing touchdowns. His supporting cast is the best he's ever had. We have a trio of competent wide receivers in round 1 rookie Zay Flowers. Odell Beckham Jr. is back and healthy. Rashad Bateman was a former round 1 pick who projects as an alpha X receiver. And it looks like he's probably going to be healthy this year. That's a nice trio. And then, of course, the headliners, tight end Mark Andrews. In the backfield, J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards are both healthy again. I think we could kind of see that some version of that 2019 season again. And he's going after the big 3 of Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, when really Lamar Jackson has as high, if not maybe even higher of a ceiling. New offensive coordinator Todd Monken's a very pass-heavy guy. I know some people are like, oh, do we like Lamar Jackson if he's running less and throwing more? Guys, it's Lamar Jackson. This is never going to be a quarterback that is a pocket passer. I don't know what we're concerned about. I'm willing to trade slightly fewer rushing yards for significantly more pass volume. This is a guy that's never even had 3,500 pass yards in a season. His prop in the betting markets is at 3,500 passing yards. Lamar Jackson's pass yards prop in the betting markets, I'll repeat, is much higher than he's ever had before. That shows the optimism for this offense. And if anyone listening to what I answered before about Alvin Kamara and David Montgomery, and they said, Josh, I'm a boomer. I'm a steak and potatoes guy. I will never wait till round 6 or round 7 to draft my first running back. You're out of your mind. That's fine. Round 4 and 5, I think Breece Hall and Dameon Pierce are great picks. Breece Hall looks like he's going to be some version of Aaron Jones to Aaron Rodgers, where Aaron Jones was always a fantasy RB1 without high volume because Aaron Rodgers is a running back's best friend in the pass game. And offenses are generally just really efficient and score a lot of touchdowns with him. So even if Breece Hall starts slowly, I kind of expect that by mid-season, Dalvin Cook is comfortably in some kind of like A.J. Dillon role where he's the early down grinder and that a lot of the touchdowns and a lot of the pass game work goes to Breece Hall. And then Dameon Pierce looks like he's going to have one of the 5 or 6 best roles in fantasy football at running back. I understand the Houston Texans offense isn't that exciting, but we know that volume matters at running back. And in the preseason, Dameon Pierce is taking pretty much every snap with the first team offense. We saw him get off to a hot start last year before he slowed down due to injuries. And again, we just want to bet on whoever we're drafting at running back. We just hope they stay healthy. And if Dameon Pierce stays healthy, he is going to be out touching Devin Singletary by a massive margin. The Bills do not like Devin Singletary. They saw him for 4 years. Singletary signed a 1-year deal for under $3 million with the Texans. I promise you, if the Bills liked him, they would have given him more than 1 year for $2.7 million. So to recap, quarterback Lamar Jackson, running backs Breece Hall and Dameon Pierce.
Well, Josh, I'm a steak and potatoes guy, and at least when it comes to technology, I'm a boomer myself. That said, when we're betting on sports here, ladies and gentlemen, I want wide receivers early as often as possible. Now, Josh, we've talked about some quarterbacks going in the early rounds. You know, Mahomes is a staple. Josh Allen's a staple. Jalen Hurts has risen to the top of that food chain, too. And Lamar Jackson's obviously a former MVP and a premium quarterback himself in fantasy. If you can't get one of those high-end options by the end of the 5th round, what's your game plan at quarterback?
I think the one remaining guy who seems like he has the clear upside to score and compete with those guys is Deshaun Watson in round 7 or round 8. He was atrocious as a passer last year. He hadn't played in nearly 2 years. He wasn't allowed to practice with the team. Obviously, that's his own doing. He made a lot of bad decisions, and he suffered the consequences. But if we are looking strictly at football and predicting this game, this is the first time that he's been with the Browns for an offseason, able to train with them. He ran 6 times per game last year, which is right in line with his career averages. It seems like his legs are still fully there. We basically just need a bounce back with passing. He's going to play behind one of the 2 or 3 best offensive lines with the Cleveland Browns. If you don't believe me or you want to learn more about that, Ryan's going to be dropping offensive and defensive line rankings along with our own Max Ford. Max played defensive end in the Canadian Football League. So I think I would trust how this guy views offensive and defensive lines. And Ryan's watched every snap of every game since 2014. That combo is quite hard to match. So I would check out their O-line, D-line rankings. They love the Browns offensive line, and you should too. He also has great skill position players where we have Amari Cooper as the wide receiver 1. The wide receiver 2 and 3 is going to be some combination of Elijah Moore and Donovan Peoples-Jones. Extremely athletic tight end David Njoku's there. And then Nick Chubb's one of the 2 or 3 best real running backs in the NFL playing behind him. That's a great supporting cast. If you want to wait further, I think Daniel Jones, Tua Tagovailoa, Geno Smith are great options around the 10th round. And I know some people out there are concerned. They're like, Josh, I've faded quarterback. I took Geno, and then I see he has a week 5 bye, and they freak out. Well, I actually think Geno Smith and Kirk Cousins as a little quarterback battery is a great way to go. Week 1, Geno faces the Los Angeles Rams. Half their defense is undrafted rookies. It's going to be the worst secondary in the NFL. Week 2, Geno Smith gets the Detroit Lions, who are once again going to be one of the worst secondaries in the NFL. They had some great off-season acquisitions, and then they suffered some pretty bad injuries. The Lions, once again, a defense to target. And then Geno, week 3, gets Carolina. I don't think the Panthers are going to be one of the better defenses this year. And then week 4, we switch to Kirk Cousins because he faces Carolina. And then week 5, while Geno's on bye, Kirk Cousins gets the Chiefs. The Chiefs allowed the most passing touchdowns to opposing passers last year. It's not even that we think the Chiefs are a terrible pass defense. It's that they're such a good offense, and it forces teams to play quickly and keep pace. And that's why opposing passers had the most passing touchdowns against the Chiefs out of all defenses. And then week 6, we've got a potential shootout, Geno Smith versus the Bengals, or Kirk Cousins against the Chicago Bears, who have a bad secondary and maybe the league's worst pass rush. So if you are fading quarterback, I think you can manufacture 20, 21 fantasy points a game from that Geno Smith, Kirk Cousins battery. Ryan, how would you attack the position at quarterback if you've waited and suddenly you go, oh my God, they're all off the board?
Yeah, my strategy is similar to yours. One guy that I really like is Daniel Jones late. Konami quarterback, rushing upside, added significant talent to their offense this year, so there's a greater passing ceiling. I believe off the top of my head, he only had 15 passing touchdowns. There's a lot of margin for growth there. And then I want to pass him with someone stable in a talented offense like Dak Prescott, Tua, Kirk Cousins. I'm willing to take a shot on Geno Smith and then play matchups with those 2 guys. Now, Josh, sleepers. The people want sleepers, Josh. Before we get into those, though, first, roster construction is very important. Strategy on this front is very important. How are you handling the double-digit rounds from a strategic standpoint?
I love how you did that. The people want the sleepers. They're going to have to
They
wait
do.
a couple more minutes for player names. In the later rounds, my general strategy is three-pronged. We want backup running backs. You can't have enough backup running backs. If your fantasy bench was 100% backup running backs, I wouldn't even say that looks bad. I'd say, you know what? Maybe I would have mixed in something else, but that's not the worst plan. We want guys that are one injury away from thrusting themselves into our starting lineup. Your fantasy bench shouldn't be players that you might be comfortable flexing. You don't want that start sit anxiety, and you don't want a player where you're crossing your fingers that he hits 10 fantasy points instead of 9. We want guys on our fantasy bench where suddenly you go, oh, this guy's projecting for 15 fantasy points this week. I'm excited and enthusiastic to start him. And that's what backup running backs give you. They're one injury away. At receiver, you want rookie or second year players. I think any rookie receiver with round 1 or round 2 draft capital that's available late, those are good bets. The worst bets are rookie receivers that have no draft capital, or dusty veterans where you're like, this is the year for Allen Robinson's bounce back. It's probably not. And then at tight end, if you took one early, don't worry about it. Same with quarterback. If you took an early quarterback, don't worry about it. If you took a later guy, then maybe you take another upside tight end like Dalton Kincaid, the round 1 rookie of the Buffalo Bills. He may have a huge role this year. There's a few other guys we'll touch on a little bit later with sleepers, but I think that's the archetype we want. Is we want a lot of backup running backs and young pass catchers to fill out the end of our roster. And I'd say you want at least 3 running backs on your fantasy bench at all times. If you're filling it out with just receivers, you're doing it wrong.
Follow Larky tweets, Josh. Instead of doing it later, let's dive right into the sleepers right now. We already made the people wait for a roster construction segment. Give us some guys you're taking towards the end of drafts.
At running back, I like Josh Kelly. Ryan, how good did it feel to get clarity on that Chargers depth chart?
Let me just put it to you this way, Josh. If I knew that Josh Kelly was Austin Eckler's direct backup in May, I would have 100% exposure to Josh Kelly in the 18th round.
Oh yeah, those early drafts we did, that would have been an auto pick. Yeah. Guess what, guys? Josh Kelly still goes really late. He's the clear backup. He had that, what was it, a 50, 60-yard run in the preseason, and I was like, ooh, I forgot that this guy actually ran in the 4.4s for his 40 time. This is a fast, big back with just enough pass catching. He may have some kind of fantasy relevant role alongside the smaller Austin Eckler. And at the very least, anything happens to Austin Eckler, Josh Kelly immediately starts for you in fantasy. I like Jerome Ford of the Cleveland Browns. Behind Nick Chubb, it's him. He's going to play probably some version of the Kareem Hunt role. He goes so much later than Kareem Hunt ever did, which makes sense. He's an unproven player, but he's 220 pounds. He's an adequate pass catcher. The team clearly likes him because they haven't done much else at running back. They let Kareem Hunt leave. The only other running back on their 53-man roster is Pierre Strong, who was released pretty much by the Patriots, or was he traded? One of those. It's hard to keep track, but basically the Patriots traded. The Patriots were like, we don't want him, and they swapped him for basically nothing. So this is a cast off from the Patriots. The best thing about this, though, for Jerome Ford, Pierre Strong is not some excellent pass catcher. Ford is probably better there. He's the other great running back pick. At receiver, I love Marvin Mims. He has round 2 draft capital. He plays on the Denver Broncos, who have a really weak receiver depth chart suddenly. They only have, I believe, 4 receivers on their roster. With the 53-man, they really just didn't do much with volume. It's Jerry Jeudy, who's nursing a hamstring injury. Cortland Sutton, who hasn't looked the same after his ACL tear 3 years ago. And then the other guy that looks to have any kind of real role is Marvin Mims. Extremely fast. He ran sub 4.4. Anytime you can get a burner like that attached to a very strong deep ball passer in Russell Wilson, I am naturally intrigued by him in fantasy, and he's going to start in 2 wide receiver sets week 1 because of that Jerry Jeudy injury. And then at tight end, we both like Juwan Johnson, extremely athletic, former receiver converted to tight end. His athletic measurables pretty much comp to a lot of receivers out there. And he broke out last year. He had a ton of touchdowns. He had some nice receiving yard games where you go, oh, this looks like someone poised to take another step forward. Anytime a guy converts from receiver to tight end, and then in his first year as tight end, he pops, that is a very, very good sign. People are like, oh, it's a little crowded there. There's Taysom Hill. There's Jimmy Graham. Guys, Juwan Johnson's the young player who just flashed last year. If anything happens to Michael Thomas, I think he could very well be the number 2 pass game option behind only Chris Olave. Ryan, what do you think about Juwan Johnson? Since I know this is a player that you in many ways kind of got me on this offseason.
Yeah, I mean, if you guys have been listening to our show regularly, I talk about the same schedule all the time. You're probably sick to death of it, but that's aspect one. New Orleans has an easy schedule. That's going to inflate numbers. That's going to inflate their win-loss record in most scenarios. The other thing is Darren Waller had a lot of success with Derek Carr in New Orleans. Darren Waller's an athletic tight end. I wouldn't quite call Juwan Johnson Darren Waller, but Michael Thomas goes down especially. I think Juwan Johnson's in a very interesting spot this season.
That's a good parallel there. Now, let's pivot to some fantasy defense talk. People out there might be like, wait, really? Yes, because Ryan out there is actually one of the few people you should trust with fantasy defenses. There's a lot of people out there, they just copy consensus rankings, or they're like, oh yeah, this defense plays the Cardinals, so you should play them. We generally want a little more in-depth info than that, because guess what? If everyone knows that, there's a chance that those defenses simply won't be available. Now, that article is on the33rdteam.com. It's free to read. It's your top 15 fantasy defenses. You approached it differently than anyone else. Talk to us about that article and your strategy for fantasy defenses.
What you said is exactly why I wrote that article. The Washington Commanders with a top 10 defensive front this week, or in week 1, are a great matchup against the Cardinals. You should play them. But here's the thing, guys. Everyone wants to do that. And, everyone wants to stream defenses. Like I hear it, oh, I don't want to take this premium defense in the 14th round because, we can just stream and get the same way. Like, listen, half your league streaming defenses. I know more about defensive personnel than, most people that play fantasy football. Most of the time, unless you want to spend fab bucks every week, like $7, $8 on them, you're going to be rolling with your 4th or 5th option in most scenarios. Like, it's not, if no one else streams defenses, you're in the driver's seat. You can play good matchups every week. What I instead like to do when possible, like for instance, let me ask you a question, Josh. It's week 17, you're in the championship. Do you not want the 49ers defense against Sam Howell's Commanders, or do you not want the Eagles defense against whatever they're doing in Arizona in week 17?
I mean, that sounds like 15 fantasy points right there.
Yeah, that sounds good. And it's one of those things where if your opponent has that, they have margin on you. You're playing from behind to a degree. So again, I don't want the 49ers defense in the 7th round. That's insanity. Unless your league is awarding points per game at a greater clip than like standard scoring formats are. I don't want to take them that early, but if it's like the 11th or 12th round, I'll take a defense like the 49ers or the Eagles a little bit earlier than most people. I'll play them in their premium matchups. I'll still stream a couple times throughout the season. Like, for instance, if the Commanders were playing the Cardinals in week 7, I would absolutely, and the 49ers are, say, they're playing the Browns, who have a premium offensive line. I'll drop a backup running back in that case, and I'll play the Commanders in that week and sit the 49ers and keep them. That's unconventional. But, like, at the end of the day, if I can get one of those premium defenses with a wonderful schedule at the end of the year when fantasy championships happen, I'm gonna do it, and I'm gonna take them.
Guys, that's Ryan Reynolds at Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. Nobody talks about the game of football like Ryan, and the way that he blends fantasy, betting, real NFL football is second to none.
Thank you kindly, Josh. Thank you kindly. Now, let's go on to the real ugly subject of fantasy football, Josh.
Yeah, let's do it.
No one wants to hear about this, but in most of our leagues, we have to pick a kicker. I'll take one a round or two early in some situations, but I'm more likely to take them in the last round than I am a defense. That said, I just said Gary, Cody, and we just did two $2,000 entry main event entries Sunday and Friday. We took Greg Joseph in both of them. Greg Joseph's a dome kicker. When we talk about the Vikings regressing from their 11-0 record in one-score games, one of the ways they can get there is they score fewer touchdowns. Justin Jefferson's a great receiver, but you're not, how many touchdowns did he have last year, Josh? 6, 7, 8? He's not like a Randy. Right. That's not his game. Usually when he scores, it's from, it's not even in the scoring zone. Jordan Addison's not he's not a red zone threat
Yeah,
either.
he's like 170 pounds.
We've already discussed how much you hate Alexander Madison, so they're not going to be able to, and you have some very valid points with him. Mike Davis is in the range of outcomes here, and if that happens, they're not going to be able to run the ball in the end zone very often either. So if the Vikings offense underwhelms in one area, I don't think it's going to be in yards. I do think it could be in scoring, and that's a way to get some margin with Greg Joseph potentially. Now, Josh, give us another kicker that you're considering that's not named Justin Tucker.
So what I often look for is I want a team that plays in a dome, like you mentioned. I want a team that I think will have a functional offense. Sometimes people are like, "Oh, if the offense is so bad, they'll have to kick field goals." And I'm like, "No, actually, if the offense is so bad, they're going to have to try and find a way to score touchdowns to keep pace." So we want kind of like these middle range offenses oftentimes. And I think a guy that fits the bill here is Younghoe Koo of the Falcons.
Yep.
The Falcons have a great offensive line. They have the second easiest schedule in the league behind only the New Orleans Saints. They're going to be moving the ball downfield. They have three blue chip young players in Kyle Pitts, Drake London, and Bijan Robinson. This is an offense that will move the ball down the field at will in a lot of those softer matchups, but they have Desmond Ridder at quarterback. I do expect a very run-heavy game plan once they get within about 10 yards of scoring. And one thing that we know year after year is that running the ball can be inefficient at times. You're less likely to turn the ball over, which is why teams often do it once they get close to the goal line. And the defense can shrink in terms of pass coverage because you're hitting that artificial boundary of the end zone. I could see them moving the ball really well and not always converting touchdowns. But they don't always need to score touchdowns if they're facing terrible opponents. I think Younghoe Koo is the sneakiest guy that could be the number one kicker in fantasy football.
I love that. I agree entirely. In fact, just to be clear with everyone, I would take Koo ahead of Joseph, and that's who we wanted in both of those drafts. Koo just went before we selected. Now, Josh, let's finish this episode up in style. A couple of weeks ago, I asked you who you couldn't leave your fantasy drafts without. You said Darren Waller. Later that same day, the Giants had a preseason game where Waller looked like the centerpiece of the Giants' passing attack. He went from the 7th round to the 4th round in the blink of an eye. You've been on Waller since the moment he was traded to the Giants. You're a big reason why I'm a little bit heavy on him. Since your last answer to that question was a 500-foot home run, I can ask you again now. Give us a player we haven't discussed yet today that you can't leave your drafts without.
All right. These are big shoes to fill, but I don't, this won't be necessarily the Darren Waller call, but I do think this is a player that I have gotten before in home league settings in round 7 that I have ranked as a 4th round pick. So we do have that type of Darren Waller parallel there. This quarterback's averaged over 22 fantasy points a game in each of his first 2 seasons before he and his star left tackle and his top 2 receivers were injured for a large chunk of last year. I thought it was going to make it 3 seasons in a row above 22 fantasy points. But when that happens, there's all the injuries. And when you look last year and you see that his 2 most targeted players were a running back and the team's 3rd string wide receiver, you know what? When that happens, you can't push the ball downfield. Only Daniel Jones and Matt Ryan averaged through air yards, so yards that the ball traveled per pass attempt, than this quarterback last year. Yet this guy is arguably the 2nd strongest arm in the league behind only Josh Allen. This team should lead the NFL in pass attempts. They finished 2nd last year behind only Tom Brady's Buccaneers. Tom Brady is no longer in the NFL. I think this team leads the league in pass attempts. This quarterback has a new offensive coordinator. The new offensive coordinator, this was one of the most egregious firings I've ever seen. All he did was lead the number 1 and then number 4 scoring offenses in the NFL the past 2 years. This offensive coordinator plays fast. His quarterback last year was 3rd fastest pace of play. The mystery quarterback that I'm looking at was 4th fastest. So he's more than comfortable keeping that blistering pace. This offensive coordinator not only played fast, but he pushed the ball downfield. His quarterback was 8th highest in air yards per pass attempt. Whereas again, that mystery quarterback was behind everyone not named Daniel Jones and Matt Ryan. This quarterback's going to be playing behind a top 10 offensive line, and the team just drafted another wide receiver in round 1 of the NFL draft. This is the best supporting cast that this young quarterback will likely ever play with. I'm expecting 5,000 passing yards and 40 passing touchdowns in the 6th or 7th round. I am taking Justin Herbert.